Assalamu alaikum. A very good evening to all the distinguished guests present here. Firstly, I extend a warm welcome to our President, Mr. Salman Khurshid, who serves as a pillar of strength for all of us. Sir, your presence inspires and motivates us on entirely a different level. Thanks for being with us today. Today, as part of the dialogue lecture series, we are honored to have with us Mr. Mani Shankar Aiyar. Sir, it's my privilege to welcome you on behalf of India Islamic Cultural Center. Sir, please, Salman Khurshid sir, Mani Shankar sir, Mr. Siraj sir, please come on the dais. Mr. Mani Shankar Aiyar is an Indian politician and diplomat. His contributions have been recognized in several areas. Mr. Aiyar served as a diplomat before entering into politics. His role in shaping India's foreign policy in earlier stages of his career has been praised for his depth and insight. As the Minister of Panchayati Raj from 2004 to 2009, Mr. Aiyar is credited with strengthening grassroots democracy in India. His efforts to empower local self-governments were widely appreciated as a step towards inclusive development. Mr. Aiyar has been vocal about his commitment to secularism and addressing socio-economic disparities in India. He is admired for championing the rights of marginal communities. He has written extensively on politics, history, and international relations, earning respect as a thinker and commentator. Mr. Aiyar has also been involved in promoting cultural exchange, preserving India's rich heritage. His appreciation for India's diverse cultures often comes through in his public appearance and writings. His latest biography and books are available on the counter with the publisher. I would like to, uh, yes, welcome first, yeah. I'll call Mr. Salman to welcome Mr. Aiyar. अच्छा ठीक है, Mr. Siraj, please.
Good evening and thank you friends for coming. This is the second talk under the IICC dialogue series. The first talk last month was by Mr. Talmiz Ahmad, who was ambassador to several countries in the Middle East. Many of you would know that Mr. Aiyar was born in Lakshmi Mansions in Lahore, which later housed Saadat Hasan Manto. So he has a long association with the top intellectual minds of the subcontinent. One of his best known works is a book entitled Confessions of a Secular Fundamentalist, which is available outside. This was published in 2006 when I read it. His wish for secularism can only be a pipe dream now, unfortunately. I would recommend that those who haven't read this book, you must get it either here or from Amazon, where it is available 20 years after publication. As a young officer in the IAS, I was one of the participants in several training programs on 73rd and 74th Amendment to the Constitution, for which he was pushing as a civil servant in the Prime Minister's office. Today he'll be speaking about India's neighborhood diplomacy. We must acknowledge that the Modi government did give enormous importance to neighborhood, and in his oath-taking ceremony in 2004, SAARC leaders were invited in May 2014. Then in 2019, BIMSTEC leaders were invited, and in 2024 also in the oath-taking ceremony, presidents of Sri Lanka, Maldives, Seychelles, and Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Mauritius, Nepal, and Bhutan were invited. Now, of course, we have new leaders in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and in our neighborhood there is enormous turmoil going on. So we know that he is a very erudite speaker, and his pen is even sharper. His writings are very sharp. Many of you would be reading it. With this, I would like to invite Mr. Aiyar to please give his talk. And, and later on, after his talk, we have the former External Affairs Minister of India, Mr. Salman Khurshid, also the president of the center, who would have dealt with India's neighborhood in his capacity as foreign minister. Okay, sir, please come. Thank you.
Good evening, all. I am very, very grateful to Siraj Hussain Saab and my colleague Shamamadi that they are relentlessly working towards putting together a regular conversation, which we call IICC dialogues. And the beginning of that endeavor has gradually caught on. More and more people are joining us, but it's a bad day today because of competing events and also the terms of the weather. But whatever it may be lacking today, I am quite sure that the sun that will shine because of the words of wisdom that we will get from my very, very dear colleague Shankar Aiyar, who I've known in so many different capacities. I discovered Shankar Aiyar when I worked briefly for government in Indraji's Prime Minister's office. He was then looking after external publicity, I think Joint Secretary. The most important job that you have is that of a Joint Secretary. Everything else doesn't matter. Joint Secretary is the person who runs the government. And so was Shankar Aiyar when he appeared in his delightful way that he always appears. And I discovered him then as somebody from outside the world of bureaucracy. And I discovered what this very special world was. And since then, I've known Mani in many, many avatars. I've known him as a minister for petroleum, where we went to him with issues that came from the ground level. There were problems. I've known him as a person who's reached out to people across the border in Pakistan. He has actually taken me across, and the only trip I've ever made to Pakistan is the trip that Mani persuaded me to make, and to meet with some extremely interesting people on the other side. I've known him as the life of any party, where he holds forth. And I've known him as a great author, as a great writer. And so introducing Shankar Aiyar here is, for me, a great honor and a great privilege. We still don't have, in the Islamic Center, we still don't have a committee on foreign affairs. We've got some outstanding people in foreign affairs, and we are talking to all of them to see if we can put them together for periodic messages that can go out from here on foreign affairs. But the gap that there is in the absence of such a committee is going to be, I think, wonderfully filled by Shankar Aiyar, who is much more than a committee alone. He can reach out to a much larger field than a committee could possibly do. And therefore, part of this continuing process that Siraj Saab has suggested, and please keep in mind, this will continue, and we have two streams of lectures. Khwaja Saab also from a different perspective is bringing in some interesting people to come and have discussions and debates here, including starting off with Laurence Gauthier and her book on Aligarh. These are things that will excite and enhance intellectual exchange in Islamic Center. Our traditional work that we do in the Islamic Center will, of course, continue apace, and we get very good audiences for that. But we now also want to take it to another level of an international level of discourse that happens on subjects that are of major concern to all of us. So the two streams of lectures that we are getting, I believe, is going to be a major feather in our cap as we move forward. We have some very exciting plans here, digitalizing this whole place, getting more and more people involved and engaged, but that will all come in due course and we will get back to you. But today, thank you for coming. And Mani, with those few words, what is there to say but for money? You wrote that book when you were returning from Pakistan, where you highlighted a poet that you had met there who said, Modi, what is his name? Rais Amrohi, who said, Hind jaane wale mera पैगाम le ja. And I thought that's a brilliant way to bridge aspirations in our two countries. And of course, for the tireless work that you have done in that field, not entirely without being attacked for it, but then I suppose you live to be attacked. And I think you'll probably get a very tame audience here tonight, but let's see how it goes. Thank you very much for coming, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mani Shankar Aiyar.
Siraj Saab, Salman Bhai, several former excellencies who are still regarded as ambassadors, and my friends. I've been invited to speak to you on India's neighborhood diplomacy. And I think the starting point should be Mr. Modi's declaration back in May 2014, when he first became the Prime Minister, that it would be his foreign policy would be based on neighborhood first. And he demonstrated his commitment to this concept of neighborhood first by inviting all the heads of government from around our neighborhood to come to Delhi for his swearing in as the Prime Minister. And then he gave priority to visiting each of our neighboring countries in turn. And so it appeared between May of 2014 and August of that year that we were perhaps unexpectedly, but in a very welcome way, entering a new phase of our foreign policy, where instead of having tense relationships with several of our neighbors, we were going to overall have a blossoming of the friendship between India and its immediate neighborhood. And the implications of having such a good relationship in the neighborhood would be global. For only then could India be seen as someone who has succeeded in making peace in its own region and therefore can be a peacemaker in the world. So that being the promise with which the Modi government set out, today, 11 years later, or nearly 11 years later, is a good time to evaluate whether this has happened. I would like to place my analysis on the basis of first categorizing the general relationship in South Asia and the general condition of South Asia, and then, time permitting, go individually through each of the countries that constitute our neighborhood and who were going to be welcoming this new policy of neighborhood first. And why do I say that? I say it because in every one of the countries that Shri Narendra Modi visited in the immediate aftermath of his becoming Prime Minister, he was accorded a kind of welcome that we have rarely seen since the time of Jawaharlal Nehru. The children were out on the streets. The rosiest cheeks were those of the Nepalis. And I don't think there are more pretty children in the world than Nepalese children. Equally in Bhutan. Then in Bangladesh he was welcomed. In the Maldives he was given a rousing welcome. So also in Sri Lanka. So it seemed, but I'm going to come to it at the end. Because it's very important to understand that our neighborhood diplomacy really begins with the smaller countries around us. And if I just logically take a round from the Maldives up the Bay of Bengal and then the Himalayan states, then Pakistan would come at the end. And I think that's the appropriate context in which to place the India-Pakistan relationship. So let's begin with Malé, with the Maldives. The Maldives were very attached to India under Mr. Gayoom, who was the first president of this country. And from 1971, when the Maldives gained its independence, but did not even have the resources to send a team to New York for the UN General Assembly, and therefore had to turn to the United States to get transport to go to New York and vote on various questions that were of deep interest to the United States. From that position, they came to establish a very strong relationship with India, particularly under Sri Rajiv Gandhi. And one of the reasons for that was that before going to the Maldives, Rajiv Gandhi had been to the islands of Lakshadweep. And in Minicoy, he found that our textbooks were written in the national language of Maldives, which is Divehi. And he made me pick up a very large number of these textbooks, and then we obtained some from the Ministry of Human Resource Development, and he presented these books to the Maldives, who discovered that there was a very close relationship between Maldives and our country. And most Indians have never been to Minicoy, and most Indians don't know that they have a language which is particular to the island and is not even spoken in all of the Lakshadweep, but is the national language of the Maldives. So there was a kind of sensitivity to the particularities of Maldives, and we set about establishing a really firm relationship with them based on a cultural link that I think very few of us knew about at that stage or even know about now. And the consequence of that was that when some dissidents in the Maldives did a conspiracy to overthrow the Gayoom government and succeeded in landing their mercenaries at the port of Malé, Gayoom escaped from his presidential palace and succeeded in putting through a call to the Indian government, to the Indian authorities, to say that there is a coup d'etat taking place in our country, and would you please help us? Within 24 hours, arrangements were made for the Indian Air Force to make a show of strength, have Indian paratroopers land in Malé, and then restore the Gayoom government. But most important of all, within 24 hours, the Indian armed forces were withdrawn from the Maldives so that Maldives could understand that we had come to their help, we had not come to conquer them. That this was not an attempt at establishing Indian hegemony over Maldives, but to assist them in their independence and whatever was the form of democracy that they would prefer. And Gayoom lasted for several decades, and that helped establish a very strong relationship with them. But in recent times, we have been playing sides in the internal politics of Maldives. And we were very close to one person who was then defeated in an election, overthrown. And we were very against his successor. And the result that there is a feeling in Maldives, in this period of 10 years that I've been talking about, that we are trying to convert Maldives into a part of India, that we are trying to determine their destiny for them. And the result of this is that the current government of the Maldives, which is headed by an interesting person called Muizu, he won the election on a slogan, India out. Just 2 words, India out, and he won a huge majority. He then insisted in breaking the old tradition that every Maldivian head of government would make a kind of ritual visit to New Delhi to say that New Delhi was their closest friend and ally. To break that, to reinforce his slogan of India out, Muizu went first to Turkey, and then he went to China. And it's only after he had established that he was not an Indian puppet that he then made the visit to New Delhi, which is essential for the economic and social life of the Maldivian islands. There's also always a security dimension to this, because the Maldives lies in the path of much of the great international trade that has made the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the bits in between very important economically, militarily, and strategically. So he insisted that the Indian military, which was playing only a civilian role in the Maldives, because we'd supplied a number of helicopters, we'd also supplied a Dornier aircraft, and all this had to be maintained. And he insisted that there should be no Indian military personnel in his state. And that caused a certain amount of consternation in Delhi, but they were all withdrawn. And once he had achieved his purpose of demonstrating that he was not an Indian agent, that he was not an Indian puppet, Mr. Muizu visited Delhi, re-established a warm relationship with our country, but made it clear that it would be an international relationship and not a relationship based on Indian hegemony. And I think this little tale that I've told about Maldives demonstrates that the worst thing India can do is to use its size to attempt to dominate its neighbors. That you cannot have a neighborhood policy in which you say that I will determine what you want because I know better than you what it is that you need. And to illustrate the importance of this, I'm going to jump all the way from the Maldives straight to Nepal. I mentioned those rosy-cheeked Nepalese children. They were delighted that we had Mr. Modi because they'd had a tense relationship in many ways with previous governments, and therefore the welcome they accorded to Mr. Modi was really from the heart. They felt that here was somebody who was going to inaugurate a new era in India-Nepal relations. And an opportunity to establish all this came up in November of 2015, a year later, when the SAARC summit took place in Kathmandu. And Mr. Modi, as the leader of the Indian government, was going to be representing India there. So since he had spent a fair amount of time, it appears, when he was more a wandering monk than a politician, in Nepal, he asked specially to go to where he had been. And that was somewhere northwest of Pokhara. The Nepalese were attempting to accommodate him when he said that on his way there, he would like to visit Janakpur, which is where Janaki came from, or Sita came from. And the Nepalese said, "You're most welcome. We'll make arrangements for you to make a kind of pilgrimage to Janakpur and the temples there." And it was, and when they agreed to that, he then said that he would like to do a public rally in Janakpur. And the Nepalese wondered why he should be doing a public rally in a foreign country when it occurred to them that elections in Bihar were about to take place. And given that elections in Bihar were about to take place, and there is a roti-beti relationship between Bihar and the Tarai, that very large numbers of those who live in the Tarai of Indian origin are married to each other, but much more girls from the Tarai marrying boys from Bihar. When Mr. Modi announced that at the rally he was going to distribute 10,000 free bicycles, the Nepalese threw up their hands and said, in that case, the rally is cancelled. They were not going to be party to the utilization of their soil for Indian election purposes. And although none of this was made explicit, it was implicit in the situation that had arisen at that time. And it's significant that Mr. Modi has not been to Nepal since then. Rosy cheeks or no rosy cheeks, he is not welcome in Nepal. And the reason for that is not just what happened at that time of the Kathmandu summit. I said 2015, I should have said 2014. About a year later, there was a terrible earthquake in Nepal. It's a very poor country. It has very poor infrastructure, and it was crippled by having an unstable domestic government. They'd had a revolution where they had overthrown the Maharajas of Nepal, all of whom were closely connected to Gorakhpur, specifically the religious institutions run by Yogi Adityanath. That is their Vatican, or it was their Vatican, of the Nepalese monarchy. And I think in India there was some disapproval in Delhi, certainly in South Block, that instead of being a Hindu kingdom, as Nepal had been under the Maharajas of Nepal, when the revolution took place, they said they are no longer a Hindu kingdom. In fact, they said they're not a kingdom at all, they're a republic. And it was a Marxist revolution. Prachanda had led that revolution, and India had helped him by giving him refuge in India while they were conducting that revolution. And therefore, New Delhi felt, the Ministry of External Affairs felt, the North Desk, the North which deals with Nepal, they felt that we've done them this great favor of giving them space to overthrow their monarchy and become a republic, and therefore we should be given special status. In the light of this, just after the earthquake took place, a 7-year deadlock was broken in the Constituent Assembly of Nepal. For 7 years, the different factions, the different parties, the different regions, the different ethnicities of Nepal had fought each other to a standstill. It's probably the only country in the world which has a communist party, it has a Marxist-Leninist party, it has a Maoist center. They really were a fractionated polity. And that's why they could not make a constitution. When you consider the contrast between India, where we prepared our constitution in under 2 years, or just about 2 years, and then consider that for 7 years the Nepalese hadn't done it, there was suddenly a breakthrough in October 2015, just about the time, I can't remember whether it was before or after, the earthquake took place. And it seemed that they had a majority to actually adopt a constitution. And it's only if they adopted a constitution that they would be able to go forward as a nation. Because ultimately, the constitution is the expression of your nationhood. And if you don't have a constitution, then you have laws that can be easily changed. You have an order, a political order, that is inherently unstable and not really understood. So without a constitution, you can't really have a republic. And without a constitution, you can't attain any of the objectives of the revolution, which has been a very bloody revolution that had taken place there. And let's not forget, it's something only in the background, but I just want to bring it up briefly, that the Ranas, who were the feudal lords of Nepal, they had subordinated the monarchy to make the monarchy the puppet of the Ranas. And there was Rana rule in Nepal from some early time in the 19th century till the independence of India. And then Jawaharlal Nehru arranged that King Tribhuvan would inform everybody that he wanted to go on a picnic. And that when he went on that picnic, the road ran past the Indian embassy. And the car suddenly turned into the Indian embassy, and the doors were clanged after the car had turned, and there was a helicopter waiting to bring King Tribhuvan from Kathmandu to Delhi. And that is how the back of the Ranas were broken and the Nepalese monarchy was established in its due place in Nepal. But the successors to King Tribhuvan had a very difficult relationship with Delhi, and therefore we were quite happy to ensure that it was changed from a monarchy into a republic. This being the background, there was also another element in the relationship, which is that the people of the Tarai are by and large of the same ethnic stock. as those who live in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Whereas the people of the hills are clearly of a different ethnic stock. And there was this tension between the hill areas and the plains areas. So Mr. Modi, knowing all this, or having been briefed about all this, had informed the Nepalese authorities, the Nepalese political authorities, that in his view, the Tarai should be split into two districts, the eastern district and the western district. And these two districts should be made autonomous so that they're able to look after their own affairs and that the hill country does not dominate over them. The other demand he made was that there should be due and proper representation for the Tarai in the Nepalese Constitution Assembly. And these were complications that further added to the confusion that existed for 7 years in Kathmandu. Suddenly, in October 2015, the Nepalese factions came together. Even the Tarai joined hands with the hills. And within a few weeks, they had found agreement on the constitution. They passed a constitution. And in that constitution, if my figures are right, I'm talking from memory, there were 130 or so members of the legislative, of the Constituent Assembly from the Tarai, and 110 of them voted in favor of the constitution. But Mr. Modi was so infuriated that they hadn't listened to him, that he sent Shankar, who was at that time the Foreign Secretary, to Nepal. And we now have, in my book, I've given all the details, so I hope some of you will at least pick up that book. I've given all the details of how, when he arrived in Kathmandu, I'm referring to the Foreign Secretary of India, not the Foreign Minister, that was in the future. The Foreign Secretary arrives not as the Foreign Secretary, but as the special envoy of the Prime Minister, to tell them that you better postpone the proclamation of your constitution by at least 2 weeks, so as to incorporate the suggestions we have made about the Tarai. And the Nepalese said, you can jump off the Qutub Minar, but we are going to divide the Tarai into 5 districts, and 2 of those districts will be incorporated into the hill areas. But they had a majority. So then we cooperated in a blockade of Nepal in the aftermath of an earthquake where they couldn't get food, they couldn't get salt, they couldn't get oil, cooking oil, they couldn't get fuel for their vehicles, and it lasted for the better part of a month. Now, if this is the way we're going to cultivate the neighborhood first policy, I think our neighborhood would say, please come to us last. So this is the kind of attitude that has taken place, not interestingly on a religious basis, for the only Hindu country in the world with whom we can treat as a Hindu majority country is Nepal. And yet Nepal, under an atheistic communist regime, decided that they were not a Hindu Rashtra, that they were going to cut their relationship with Yogi Adityanath's Gorakhpur institution, and that they would go forward in the only way they could do it, which is to become close to China. Now, where the Indian ambassador says, and I've quoted him, I've quoted his autobiography, in which he says he wondered what to do when he was invited to the swearing in of the new government after the proclamation of the Constitution. And in order not to have to shake the hands of the new Prime Minister or any of his ministers, he slipped out of the assembly and went home. And he's boasting about it. He's very proud of the fact that he was able to obey Delhi's instructions and not be in a friendly relationship with the new government. So the new government, which was headed by K.P. Oli Sharma, many people, he calls himself K.P. Oli, so they thought he was a Muslim, that he was K.P. Ali, who was pronouncing his name as Oli, but it turned out that he's actually a Brahmin, K.P. Oli Sharma. K.P. Oli Sharma went immediately to Beijing and signed a dozen accords with them. And when at about that time, I happened to go to Kathmandu and was seated in the VIP room while the Indian embassy looked around for a car to get me sent to my place of stay. I was looking at the destinations that were coming up in the flights that were leaving or coming into Kathmandu, and I was amazed as to how many Chinese cities the Nepalese are flying to. And in the city, I found big posters saying these are places where you can learn the Chinese language. Now, since one of the main strategic objectives of India has been to keep Nepal on our side as a kind of pasban at the foot of the Himalayas to prevent anyone from the other side, China, coming in here. We achieved, Mr. Modi achieved exactly what we had hoped they would never do. There is a strong relationship between Beijing and Delhi and Kathmandu, which we had attempted, I think, foolishly, to try to stop. You can't determine some other country's foreign policy. But we did that, and they then openly went in favor of China. And you can see what happened immediately after the Constitution was adopted. While we were publicly, through a special envoy, Mr. Shankar, telling them to postpone the proclamation of the Constitution until the Constitution was changed in accordance with Indian wishes, not Nepali wishes. The Chinese ambassador greatly welcomed the new Constitution, and so did the US ambassador, to which, according to the report that I have quoted by a man called Sudhir Sharma, their names are the same as in ours, so it's very difficult to tell who is a Nepali and who's an Indian. But Sudhir Sharma is the head of Kantipur Daily, which is one of their leading English language newspapers. He says that, Namaskar, he says that that the behavior of Jaishankar, who is a foreign service officer, is a colleague of mine, he's a respectable, civilized human being. They said that he threw his weight around like Lord Curzon. I'm quoting from the newspapers of the time. He was behaving like Lord Curzon, and he was telling them that no support from China or the US can make up for the dissatisfaction of India. Now, if this is neighborhood first, how can we expect South Asia to come together? And what no one knew when Modi ji had gone to Kathmandu in November 2014, and for a TV program, I was sent to Kathmandu at the same time. So I witnessed some of this with my own eyes. That after, and that's where I was informed by my Nepalese friends of what was the reason behind this Nepalese anger, because it was not generally known in India. And the Nepalese were not attempting to, inform the Indian press so that there could be an explanation. They were just hoping that they would be treated as a sovereign nation and that we wouldn't be stepping on their toes. But I've given you the inside story as I received it from Nepali sources, which have since been confirmed in published material, one by the Indian ambassador. I think it's called Kathmandu Diary or Kathmandu Mission or something. Kathmandu? Oh, a Kathmandu Dilemma. Yeah, it's by by Ranjit Ray, our ambassador too. In fact, subsequently, we had an ambassador to Kathmandu who was described to me by the Nepalese as the best Indian ambassador there's ever been in Kathmandu. So I said, well, why do you say that? He said he's so fond of playing golf that he spends all his time on the golf course instead of subverting the Nepal government. This is the reputation that the Indian Foreign Service, that Indian foreign policy, and Modi ji's neighborhood policy has succeeded in acquiring in a country which stands at the frontier of India. They are the pasban. If we cannot cultivate them, are we not putting the security of our own nation into jeopardy? And then we've had, as a consequence of all this, certain territorial disputes. And when you consider what these territorial disputes are, then I invite you to go to the town where I was really brought up as a young person, Dehradun. It was part of Nepal. The Gorkha regiment sings a song called Nainitalo because Nainital was part of Nepal. All of Garhwal was part of Nepal. When you go to Kasauli and look down, it's where the biggest battle took place. And the British pushed the Nepalese back. So they have claims. But we are now guarding our imperial legacy by saying that not an inch to anyone else. So there is a triangle to which I give the acronym KKL, because that's the name of the 3 points. And it's become a major matter of dispute between India and Nepal. So it's not just that the Maldives was reacting to our determining their destiny, Nepal was also reacting in that way. I now turn to another country, and Ambassador Khanna is here. He was our ambassador in Bhutan. Bhutan has the most friendly possible relation with India, at least on the surface. The Crown Prince, who is now the 5th King of Bhutan, became a very close family friend of ours. So he came to weddings in our family and so forth. So we used to have a lot of informal conversation. And he told me that his father had asked him to stand up and look south. So he looked in the direction of India. And then he said, turn around and look north, which was in the direction of China. And then his father said to him, what do you see in the north? And he replied, I see high mountains, ice and snow. And he said, what do you see in the south? He said, I see fertile lands that are irrigated by rivers that run from the Himalayas into the plains. So he says, now do you understand Bhutan's foreign policy? That if we establish a relationship with the north that is closer than with the south, then we are bringing impossible logistical difficulties on Bhutan. And therefore we must ensure that the basis of our foreign policy is a very friendly relationship with India. But that requires that India be sensitive to their requirements. And they've come to the conclusion that the peculiarity of China's borders should be recognized by the Indian subcontinent. Because China has borders with 14 different countries. 14 different countries. They have settled their border disputes with 12 of these 14 countries. And that includes the Soviet Union, which is now the Russian Federation. And there was a battle in 1969 at Amur where there was shooting, where Russian soldiers died and Chinese died. And yet, even with Vietnam, which is a country they've been repeatedly invading through history, there has been a settlement. So 12 out of the 14 neighbors of China have settled their border disputes. There are only two that haven't. One, of course, is India, and the other is Bhutan. And after the Doklam standoff, which took place more on the border of Bhutan than on the border of India, the Bhutanese have been repeatedly sending their king and their prime minister, a wonderful man called Chering Tobgay, whom again I've had the privilege of meeting, and who invited my wife and me to spend a holiday in Bhutan, just as the king and his consort invited us also. They've been coming again and again to Delhi in recent months. Now one doesn't know what they're talking about, but clearly they want to be given the authority by New Delhi to settle the border between Bhutan and China. Because at that border, particularly in the area that has now become known as Doklam, very well known, I mean, as Doklam, there are Chinese structures of a permanent nature coming up. There are villages being built which are manned largely by the People's Liberation Army of China. And it is land which is used by the shepherds or the cowherds of Bhutan. So a settlement would enable a certain section of their population to go and graze their cattle on the other side of whatever becomes the border between China and Bhutan. And in my opinion, I have no proof, we are preventing them from making a settlement until it is part of the Indian settlement. So, despite the fact that Bhutan wants the very best of relations with India, there are Bhutanese, and poor Ambassador Khanna had to face some of them, who are just viciously anti-Indian and do not want to see the relationship getting built. But by and large, the population of Bhutan and the population and the establishment of Bhutan want to have a harmonious relationship with us. But they have their own national interests, and we have to allow them some leeway to exercise their own sovereignty. Otherwise, there's no meaning to neighborhood first. Now, against the background of this relationship between India and three of its smaller neighbors, I've referred already to the Maldives, to Nepal, and to Bhutan. Let us now come to India's relationship with some of the larger countries, beginning with the smallest of the larger countries, which is Sri Lanka. Now, we've had a very tangled relationship with Sri Lanka, and the latest development there is that after the economic crisis of 2022, which led to the protest which is called Argalaya in Sinhalese, the democratic process has overthrown all the feudal families that were ruling the politics of Sri Lanka. When I was a student at Cambridge, I had a very close Sri Lankan friend, a Christian called Hemal Pieres. And when I would talk to him, I'm talking of 60 years ago, about Ceylon politics, it was all about Auntie Sirimavo and Uncle Felix. So it was the dynasties that were running the place. You had the Senanayakes, you had the Bandaranayakes, you had the Premadasas, you had the Rajapaksas, you had the Vikramasinghes. And just between these 5 or 6 families, who were enormously rich and enormously influential, the politics, the internal politics of Sri Lanka, which was earlier called Ceylon, was determined. Now we've had an election in which every single one of the feudal families of Sri Lanka have been thrown out of power. It's a revolution equal to the Russian Revolution of 1917, but without one drop of blood being shed. It's through the democratic process. But whom has it thrown up as the president of Sri Lanka? A man called Anura Disanayaka. Anura Disanayaka was a gun-toting terrorist of the JVP only about 35, 40 years ago. They were the ones who said that this is a Sinhala country, this is a Buddhist country, and were the chief enemy of the Tamils. They were dominant in southwest Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and the Tamils live in the northeast. So we think of Tamils as South Indians, they think of them as North Ceylonese. So they were the ones who were providing the emotional ammunition for the Sri Lankan government's ill treatment of the Tamils, which had led to the terrorist organization called the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, to rise. And it was into that we got caught, and the IPKF was mauled. That's the only word we can use. The leader of the Sinhala side in that fight, Anura Disanayaka, is now confronting us as the president of Sri Lanka. And how has he confronted us? As a candidate, he arrived in Delhi and said he wanted good relations with Delhi. And as president, he has visited us and says he wants good relations with us. And amazingly, at least 12 of his candidates have won from the Jaffna region, which is totally dominated by the Tamils. They have voted for the JVP. And did we ever anticipate any of this? I don't know, and I cannot find out. But whenever the papers of the Ministry of External Affairs are released, I'm willing to bet that our High Commission in Colombo and whatever intelligence agents are operating there, they could not have predicted that there would be this enormous change in Sri Lanka that has taken place, a revolution that can be compared to the Russian Revolution of 1917. And are we going to respect the right of this revolutionary regime that has now come into power through democratic means to exercise its sovereignty? Or are we going to do with Sri Lanka what we tried to do with Nepal, where a revolutionary regime was ushered in on oceans of blood, or at least rivers of blood, and we assisted in that process. And then we turned against them. So this is a challenge to which I cannot give an answer today. But were the Islamic Center to invite me in 5 years to speak again about our neighborhood policy. Perhaps I can tell you how we handled the new situation in Sri Lanka. But it shows that we just cannot determine what the course of politics is going to be, even in small countries that have populations that are about the same as that of Noida, of the national capital region. That's all they have by way of population. I cannot determine that. And still there are people in South Block, especially now in the western part of South Block, which is where the Prime Minister's office is, where they say ki we are the great country of South Asia and we are going to determine not only the fate of India but the fate of all of South Asia, and we are going to confront the Chinese because the Chinese are standing in the way of our natural position as the hegemon of South Asia. What fantasies are we living in? We live in the 21st century, which has seen the fantasies of the United States defeated in China, defeated in Korea, defeated in Vietnam, defeated in Laos, defeated in Cambodia, defeated in all the stans of the former Soviet Union, defeated in Afghanistan more than anywhere else, defeated in Iran, defeated in several parts of West Asia, and they're there. Still the richest country in the world, still the biggest military power, still the ones who are the champions of democracy, and the example of their democracy is Mr. Trump. That this country wants to imitate them and become the hegemon of South Asia. Now, what a farcical fantasy, and with what dreadful consequences for ourselves. So unless we curb our ambition to be a dominant power and instead transform it into being a friendly neighbor, one that has far more resources than any of our neighbors and could therefore be of great assistance to these countries, if we cannot convert our mental attitude into one of friendship with these people instead of attempting to dominate them, I'm afraid the future looks very grim for any neighborhood policy. And so long as we are caught in this bind, I don't see how we can become a world power that is respected. When Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister of India, we were much poorer than we are today. We had much less military strength than we had today. We certainly had much less economic strength than we had today. And yet, India was the peacemaker, because non-alignment, which was Nehru's foreign policy, was the external expression of non-violence, which was Mahatma Gandhi's domestic policy. And therefore we prevailed. I see that there are a lot of youngsters here for whom what I'm going to say might sound like ancient history, but they were part of my growing up. How did the Korean War come to an end? By making India the chairman of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission. How did the war in Indochina come to an end? By making India the chairman of the International Supervision and Control Commission in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia. How did India become an important player in West Asia? By being the only non-Muslim, non-Asian country to vote against the partition of Palestine. And we did that because we'd just seen the horrors of the partition of India. That partition is no solution to, it's not a basic solution to problems. reconciliation is, not partition. We voted against it, and we refused to recognize Israel at the diplomatic level until 1994. And in that period, India was called upon to head the peacekeeping force in Gaza after the 1956 invasion by Britain, France, and Israel against Egypt. We were the people who were heading the peacekeeping force in Cyprus, where the Turks and the Cypriots, the Turks and the Greeks, were fighting each other. We were the ones who were heading the force in the Congo. We were the ones who were contributing to peace in Rwanda. But tell me, which country has turned to Modi's India to ask for its intervention to bring about peace? And it's so comical that we should say we will bring peace to Ukraine when we are unable to bring peace to Manipur. So these pretensions have to be removed. And until these pretensions are removed, I'm now in a position to come to our two big neighbors. The one to our east, Bangladesh, and finally, the one to our west, Pakistan. As far as Bangladesh is concerned, we have been very, very partisan in regarding the liberation as our contribution to Bangladesh, and that gives us the right to determine their destiny. And it has failed, because whatever were the gains, and they were enormous, of the liberation struggle of 1971, and under Indira Gandhi's absolutely brilliant leadership, we held back until conditions were right for a military thrust. We completed the operations in 2 weeks' time, and we took full advantage of the Mukti Bahini, which we had trained militarily, but much more important politically. We won. And at that time, on the day, or literally at the minute, that the surrender documents were being signed in Dhaka, I, as the Undersecretary of the Economic Division in the Ministry of External Affairs, which was a kind of punishment posting, because it wasn't even in South Block, it was in Shastri Bhavan, I was made the secretary of a committee that was established under the chairmanship of Shukumar Chakravarti to deal with relief supplies to Bangladesh so that they could take back their refugees. And in that capacity, I made my first visit to Dhaka within 1 month of the liberation. And there at the breakfast hall, I ran into Sidney Schanberg, who was the Herald Tribune correspondent, who had alerted the world to the genocide taking place in East Pakistan at the hands of their fellow Muslims in West Pakistan. So I walked up to him to thank him for the major role he played. And he says to me, "You guys have lost the plot." So I said, "This is just 1 month after liberation." So I said, "How have we lost the plot?" He says, "The Indian army, which was then in occupation of Bangladesh, is claiming that it won the war and is not giving any credit to the Mukti Bahini. And this is going to cost you dear. And the reason why we've had these complicated difficulties with the young man who started the armed revolution in East Bengal Rifles, which was the core of the future Bangladesh army, was none other than the commander in Chittagong, which is now called by another name. It's called Chattogram or something. His name was Ziaur Rahman, and he became the president. It was he who had killed Mujibur Rahman. And I had the personal experience, which I've still not got over, and it's explained in detail in my book about my ministership in the Petroleum Ministry, that in January 2005, an announcement was made that the Indian gas company called GAIL, the Gas Authority of India Limited, had in collaboration with a Korean firm struck gas at a site, an offshore site called A3, almost next to, in the sea, the town of Sitwe, which in the Second World War was famous as the town of Akyab. And I rushed to Burma. I asked for a trilateral meeting between Bangladesh, Burma and me, the three ministers. Our High Commission in Dhaka was most disapproving of this initiative. Delhi was also, by which I mean South Bloc, was most disapproving because the essence of their policy was that we should do nothing that would give credit to Begum Khalida. We were not looking at Bangladesh. We were looking at individuals. Our candidate was Sheikh Hasina. Their candidate was Begum Khalida. And so we must have nothing to do with Bangladesh. I arrive in Dhaka, in Yangon, and get a telegram from our High Commissioner in Dhaka saying that reliable sources have informed me that the Bangladesh minister being sent to Yangon is a minister of state in Sheikh Hasina, in Begum Khalida's cabinet, and he has been told to not agree to any Indian proposal until three conditions are met. One, that they should get a share of the gas if they are going to allow India to transit through Bangladesh to bring the gas from Burma to Haldia. And why Haldia? Because Haldia was going to bring up a petrochemical complex. And the Chief Minister, Bhattacharya, had actually come to my hotel to meet me, where I was holding a Panchayat Raj meeting, in order to beg me to give them gas to ensure that our petrochemical complex in Haldia would successfully come up. So the first condition was that they should get a share of the gas. The second condition was that they should get electricity directly from Bhutan and not via India. And the third condition was that we must make a notable contribution to reversing their balance of trade, which was heavily weighted against Bangladesh. So I called on, before we met trilaterally, I called on this Bangladesh minister and I said to him, I guarantee you, not only that you can get a share of the gas that we have found and want to transport through your country to our country, but that you can add a connecting pipeline to this main pipeline from Brahmanbari, which is in the northeast of Bangladesh, in order to get your gas to your industrial complex, which is in Jessore, in the southwest corner of Bangladesh, almost on the border of India. So that problem was solved. He was going to get gas, which he couldn't otherwise have got, and utilize his own gas, which he couldn't otherwise have done. The second point was free electricity, or not electricity for which they would pay, but it would be directly sent to them instead of routed through India. I said, if you can get Bhutan to agree, then we agree too. And said to myself that if the Ministry of External Affairs has some serious reason for stopping the Bangladeshis from buying electricity directly from Bhutan, well, we are influential enough in Bhutan to stop the Bhutanese from accepting this. So I said, the problem is not ours. You ask Bhutan, and if Bhutan agrees, then we can go through with it. But I'm not sure that Bhutan will. And as for the third, I said, I can do nothing about the balance of trade, but we will be giving you transit fees, which will change the capital account. So on the balance of payments, you will get an advantage which can rectify what is happening on the balance of trade. And the minister agreed with me. We then went to see the Burmese Minister of Oil, and it was a case of Mia Bibi Razi to kya karega Kazi? He said yes, yes. So then I thought I'd try a joke with him. I said, we are in a win-win situation and not in a nay-win situation. But he looked very grim, because if he'd smiled, he may have been brought before an army assassination squad. So we settled the matter. There were some technical things to be done. So we said that we'll have 3 working group meetings in Yangon, Dhaka and Delhi. At the first meeting in Yangon, all the technical problems were solved. We were going to get our gas, we'd found it, our gas to fund our petrochemical complex in India. And on the way, we could get it across to India by going via Cox's Bazar and on to Jessore. And along the way, we would accept the gas of Bangladesh from Brahmanbari and deliver it for them at their industrial complex in Jessore. I can't think of a better solution. Our High Commissioner was completely against it. Completely against it, saying the credit will go to Begum Khalida. And Delhi was so against it, the Foreign Secretary, that I was asked by the Foreign Minister to go slow. And I said, the Burmese are begging us to come to this solution, because otherwise the Chinese, who are dominating the Burmese economy, its polity, its military, almost making Burma a puppet state of Beijing, they will be strengthened by Indian gas going to Kunming. And yet, because we were playing games in Bangladesh, we were trying to back up Sheikh Hasina against Begum Khalida. We ended up with the Indian gas discovered by India arriving in Kunming and not arriving in Haldia. So to this extent, our foreign policy is ready to cut our nose to spite our face. What did we gain from discovering the gas only for the Chinese to take it and depriving us? And all because you didn't want Khalida to get the credit. But if we laid the pipeline, it would have been inaugurated by Hasina anyway. So she could have got the credit. But are we in this game for India's interest or for the interest of South Bloc? Which says, who are you in the Petroleum Ministry to say things about foreign policy? That we are the authority on foreign policy. You are, but what is your foreign policy? Making enemies in our neighborhood? And that, of course, brings me straight to Pakistan. It's a country with whom the current establishment has changed foreign policy into a domestic policy. Pakistan is no longer the domain of the Ministry of External Affairs. It is the domain of the Ministry of Home Affairs and of the Prime Minister's office. Because basically, if you're going to run your politics as Mr. Modi and his cohort are doing, on the basis of dog whistling the Muslim community, of creating divisions between Hindus and Muslims, of securing votes on the basis of spreading hatred and prejudice against the Muslims, if you make it fashionable for it to be said openly what might in the past have been said in closed bedrooms, that you don't like these Muslims, how can we have good relations with Pakistani Muslims when your main objective is to alienate Indian Muslims? That is, I think, the existential dilemma before South Asia. And how has it been implemented? It began with a jhappi in New Delhi when Nawaz Sharif came for the swearing in of Mr. Modi. It was agreed that the two foreign secretaries would meet in the third week of August 2014 and re-begin the processes that had been held a little bit on the side when Musharraf fell and there was some uncertainty about the future of the Pakistan government. Comes August and the Pakistan High Commissioner invites the Hurriyat to tea at the Pakistan High Commission. Now, how were they being called to the Pakistan High Commission for tea? It's because under Mr. Vajpayee, not Dr. Manmohan Singh, under Mr. Vajpayee, it had been agreed that the government of India must engage with the Hurriyat to be able to handle its relationship with Pakistan. And this was agreed upon to the extent that the Hurriyat was allowed to send its delegation to Pakistan. And because Khurshid Kasuri, who was the foreign minister of Pakistan at that time, is one of my closest friends. We were college mates at Cambridge, so I've known him for 60 years. He said to me that the biggest roadblock on the way to solving the Kashmir problem is Gilani. And who was Gilani? He was advocating the integration of Kashmir with Pakistan. And here's the Pakistan foreign minister telling me that the worst element in India is Gilani. So in these circumstances, we have to understand the reality on the ground. I was posted by Mr. Vajpayee, incidentally. He was the foreign minister of India in Moraji's government, to Pakistan as India's first ever consul general. I arrived on the 14th of December 1978 and went to my office at about 3 in the afternoon. The whole building, which is a massive building on Fatima Jinnah Road, was being repaired. So all of us, from the consul general to the driver, were sitting in a single room with a single telephone between us. The phone rang, my clerk picked it up, and looking rather surprised, he said, "It's a call for you, sir." I said, "Really? From whom?" He says, "It's from the office of the Deputy Commissioner, Sakkar." I thought it was very strange that a Pakistani civil servant should be telephoning directly to a foreign representative. Anyhow, I picked up the phone and there was a pathetic voice at the other end who introduced himself as the liaison officer appointed by the Pakistan government to deal with an Indian sadhu who, at the instance of Mr. L.K. Advani, who had visited Pakistan as the information minister 1 month before I arrived in Karachi, they had agreed to this Indian sadhu coming from Raipur, or was it Indore, to Sakkar, to a place called Sardbela. and there doing his pravachan. So this chap was the liaison officer to that Indian sadhu, and he said to me in Hindustani, and I'm going to speak in English, otherwise I think we get complicated. Anyway, let me see. He said, साहब मैं बहुत मुश्किल में हूँ. तो मैंने कहा क्यों, क्या हुआ? He says, आप जानते हो ना कि आपके संत हमारे यहाँ आए हैं. तो मैंने कहा हाँ मैं जानता हूँ, सुनने में आया है, लेकिन मैं तो अभी अभी यहाँ पहुँचा हूँ, मैं आपकी मदद कैसे कर सकता हूँ? तो उन्होंने कहा कि मैं बहुत मुश्किल में हूँ क्योंकि आपके हिंदू संत के जो मुसलमान मुरीद हैं वो उनसे मिलना चाहते हैं. तो मैंने कहा कि इसमें क्या दिक्कत है? He says, आप हमें इजाज़त देते हो? मैंने कहा ज़रूर मैं इजाज़त देता हूँ. And so my posting in Pakistan began with my royally, grandly giving permission to Pakistani Muslim murids to meet with a Hindu sant. Can you imagine the impact it would have on my mind? I wondered, what kind of a country have I come to? Why do we regard them as an enemy? And then some years or so later, I had become very friendly with the son of the Peer of Hala, who is one of the biggest peers of Pakistan. So I said to Amin Fahim, who later became the Peer himself, but at that time he was the eldest son of the Peer. So he was a Peer Zada, if you like. So I asked Amin Fahim, I told him this story, and I said, कि आपके वालिद के हिंदू शागिर्द थे क्या? He says, of course. So I said, but what happened to them after partition? वो तो भारत भाग गए. He says, आज तक वो हमारे संपर्क में है. तो मैंने कहा, आज तक हिंदुस्तान गए हुए सिंधी हिंदू आपके वालिद के संपर्क में है? कैसे? He said, वो जबकि उनके खानदान में कुछ अच्छी चीज़ होती है, जैसा कि कोई इम्तिहान पास करता है, या किसी को काम मिल जाता है, या कोई शादी होती है, या बच्चा पैदा होता है, तो वो मेरे वालिद के आशीर्वाद के लिए हमें दरख्वास्त भेजते हैं. तो ऐसे, लेकिन दरख्वास्त कैसे भेजते हैं? Amin Fahim looked at me as if I was mad and said, through the smugglers, of course. So I said, गुस्ताखी माफ, लेकिन मुझे बताया गया है कि आपके वालिद जो हैं वो आपने आशीर्वाद दुआ नहीं देते जब तक कि नजराना उनको पेश नहीं किया जाता. So instead of being embarrassed, he said, of course, नजराना देने पर ही दुआएं मिलेंगी. तो ऐसे, लेकिन वो नजराना कैसे भेजते हैं? इसे वही स्मगलर के जरिए. तो 5 रुपए आते थे एक चिट्ठी के साथ. स्मगलर लाता था हैदराबाद से होकर, सिंध थार डेजर्ट से होकर पाकिस्तान के अंदर. पीर साहब को दिलवाया जाता था. पीर साहब 5 रुपए रख लेते थे अपने जेब में और फिर अपनी दुआएं भेजते थे. I didn't ever tell Delhi that I discovered this route. But it is the reality of our subcontinent. It is a reality based on the fact that after 666 years, please note these years, after 666 years of a Muslim Sultan or a Muslim Badshah being on the throne of Delhi, from 1192, when Muhammad Ghori replaced Prithviraj Chauhan on the throne of Delhi, till 1868, when Bahadur Shah Zafar was deposed by the East India Company, there was continuously a Muslim leader or a Muslim monarch sitting on the throne of Delhi, with mostly Muslim feudatories being the princes around the country. Now, if you look at Islam in a global perspective, Islam either wins or loses. They have been totally triumphant from Afghanistan, or even more speaking through the stans of Central Asia and Afghanistan, all the way to Mauritania and West Africa, where they are Muslim countries. Everyone is Muslim. And east of us, from Bangladesh, and then through Malaysia to Indonesia, which is the most populous Muslim country in the world, to the southern Philippines, there's a complete triumph of Islam. But when it gets defeated, it gets totally defeated. In the Pyrenees, which separate France from Spain, there was the Battle of Tours, which the Muslims lost. And then there was the Battle of Vienna, which the Muslims lost. And so there are no Muslims in all of Western Europe. So Islam either wins completely or loses completely, except in Hindustan. After 666 years of Muslim rule in India, as my BJP friends would put it, after 666 years of so-called Muslim rule in India, there was a census conducted by the British in 1872, which showed that only 24% of Indians were Muslims. 76% retained their own religion. It's the only place in the whole world where Islam learned to coexist with other religions, and where a Hindu majority learned to coexist with a Muslim minority. This is the genius of our country. And into this genius, first Muhammad Ali Jinnah brings in his two-nation theory. It is supported, in fact, the earliest exponent of it was V.D. Savarkar, who said, and he, in 1943, on August 15th, he was reported in the Gazette as having stated in Nagpur that Jinnah is completely right. There are two nations, and that therefore we cannot have any Muslims in Hindu India. Let them go to the Islamic lands, and we are going to remain where we are. And we opposed that and said that Pakistan can become an Islamic republic, but we are not going to become a Hindu Rashtra. And therefore it was possible for Nehru to make Pakistan a foreign policy issue. And although he didn't succeed in establishing a good relationship, I think we forget that in 1955, the chief guest at our Republic Day parade was Ghulam Muhammad, the President of Pakistan. That when Muhammad Ali Bogra came to India in 1953, Nehru said, I agree to a plebiscite under UN auspices in Kashmir, but subject to the plebiscite administrator not being an American. It has to be somebody neutral, and he had in mind Scandinavia, somebody from Norway, Sweden, Finland, somewhere. So we had an engagement. It was an engagement in which the final stage was when Sheikh Abdullah, along with Jayaprakash Narayan, and I think one or two others, went across to Pakistan in May 1964. And while they were negotiating a settlement of outstanding issues, Panditji died, and so the delegation returned. And then I take a leap forward. Rajiv Gandhi, he went to Pakistan for the first time in nearly 30 years, because the last visit made by an Indian Prime Minister to Pakistan had been in 1960, when Nehru went on the occasion of the signing of the Indus Waters Treaty. 28 years later, an Indian Prime Minister had the courage to walk across the border. And when he went there, he made a banquet speech, which is again quoted at some length in my book. where he said that why is it that when Indians and Pakistanis go outside the subcontinent, they become the best of friends, whether in Dubai or in Birmingham or in America. Why can we not meet in our own homes? And the contrast between that and a situation I face today, where a Pakistani activist for good relations between India and Pakistan has been selected by an Indian organization to receive a peace prize and is not only being denied a visa to come here to receive the prize, but the organizers of that prize are being attacked for having picked a Pakistani for the peace prize. And why is that? It's because there is only one major roadblock on the way to making India a Hindu Rashtra, and that is the presence of 300 million Muslims in West Pakistan and 200 million Muslims here in India. If they hadn't existed, then this would automatically be a Hindu Rashtra. And because they do exist, Jawaharlal Nehru had the wisdom to say that we should have a secular republic and not a Hindu republic. And Mahatma Gandhi said that he was going to spend the rest of his life in Pakistan, bringing about a reconciliation of hearts in the same way as he had been in Noakhali, which is in Bangladesh, for 4 months in 1946. So, if your attitude towards your own people is the attitude that I see in the Modi government, I just don't see how they will make friends with the ex-Indian Muslims who live in Pakistan. It would be a complete contradiction for him to have a good relationship with Pakistan Muslims when his principal domestic platform is to have a bad relationship with Indian Muslims. I think this is the existential dilemma. Of course, to this many things are added. I had earlier stated and then drifted away from it, the Tea Party to which the Pakistan High Commissioner had invited the Hurriyat in early August 2014. The Indian government told the Pakistan High Commissioner that he could not invite the Hurriyat to tea. But they had already been invited. They came. And in retaliation for that, the Indian Foreign Secretary, Sujata Singh, who was readying herself to go to Islamabad to start the conversation, was not only asked not to go, but was actually sacked from that position. And ever since then, our relationship with Pakistan has been frozen. Now, there are two ways of solving our problems with Pakistan, and the problems are very real. They're very real because there is terrorism, cross-border terrorism, that has its origin in organizations in Pakistan. At the same time, we have to recognize that Pakistan is not only the single biggest exporter of terrorism, it is also the single biggest victim of terrorism. They have terrorism which comes from their frontier regions into the heart of the country. I mean, children sitting in a school are brutally massacred. So we have a situation where the government is not really in control. And any group in Pakistan that wants to upset the apple cart with India only has to conduct one terror operation to disrupt the entire process. And that is what they did. So when Mr. Modi decided that he would suddenly fetch up in Lahore, in Raiwind, to bless the granddaughter of Nawaz Sharif on the eve of her wedding and to say happy birthday to Nawaz Sharif. It was regarded in India as a great breakthrough. But then when the attack on Pathankot took place, the terrorist attack on Uri took place, that was the end of the process. And for 10 years now, we have had no relationship with Pakistan. I don't understand a government that has the courage to undertake surgical strikes against these Pakistanis. Why don't they have the courage to sit across a table and talk to them? And if you don't talk to Pakistan, then how are you going to solve a problem? Or do you want the problems to fester? I think they want the problems to fester so that Indians can equate Pakistan with Muslims and Muslims of Pakistan can be equated with the Muslims of India, and thus the domestic purpose of alienating the Muslim community in order to build up a Hindu vote bank can be promoted. Which is why when I went to Pakistan, as I often do, I don't think there's any Indian who has been to Pakistan as often as I have. In the 40 years that have passed since my posting in Pakistan, I've been to Pakistan more than 40 times. In order to continue this human relationship, because I was the beneficiary, I'm boasting now, but you'll forgive me, that I organized the visa system in the Indian Consulate General in such a manner that anyone collecting a visa form found stamped on it the date on which, if they arrived at 9 in the morning to hand in the visa form, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, their visas would be ready. So when we arrived at the 100,000th, 1 lakh visa, we were at 99,990. I called in 10 Pakistani journalists to act as my visa clerks. And I placed them in front of the windows and I said, well, one of you is, I don't know who, but one of you is going to be handing over the 100,000th visa. And this was about 5 months after we'd opened the visa office. 1 lakh we'd succeeded in doing. And when it came to that 1 lakh, I told the candidate who'd won that I would pay his visa fee and that here I was presenting him with a tin of Darjeeling tea. At which point, slogans started coming from the remaining Pakistani visa seekers. Their slogans were, thank you, their slogans were, हिंदुस्तान के कौंसल जनरल जिंदाबाद जिंदाबाद, यहाँ कोई पाबंदी नहीं, यहाँ कोई रिश्वत नहीं, हिंदुस्तान जिंदाबाद. An enemy country saying this in the Indian missions office? We were invited, my wife and I, to dinner at the Sindh Club by somebody I had met somewhere at a social occasion who wasn't talking. So to encourage him, I said to him, very banal question, I said, have you been to India? He said, yes. So I said, really, where did you go? He said, Meerut. Wouldn't continue. So I said, Meerut. And how long were you in Meerut? He said, 3 years. I then realized he was a prisoner of war. So he saw the expression on my face and he said, if your wife and you are free to join us to dinner tomorrow evening at the Sindh Club, they've got an excellent port laid down. As a Muslim, I can't sign for it, but you please sign for it as a non-Muslim and I'll pay the bill. So we had this gorgeous dinner in the Sindh Club And we were walking home, and Sunit says to me, "This is an enemy country, right?" It's a question that has reverberated in my mind, not only for the 3 years I was in Pakistan, but in the 40 and more years that have passed from then. Is it an enemy country? Or is it that the people of Pakistan, having got their wretched Pakistan and having made a mess of that Pakistan, do they still want to fight us? I'm sure there are elements in every section of Pakistan society who regard the jihad against India as their principal religious duty. But I imagine that they are in a tiny minority. The bulk of the people of Pakistan, from what we were able to gather during our 3 marvelous years in Karachi. My daughter Suranya was 5 or 6 years old. She went to the convent of Jesus and Mary, and they're going to have a reunion of the children who were at the convent imminently. And the problem is, will she get a visa to go to Pakistan? My daughter, my youngest daughter, was born in Pakistan. She was born in Karachi. So we decided to give her a Muslim name. She's called Sana. But her surname remains Aiyar. And she has tremendous difficulties at Indian passports, saying, Karachi में पैदा हुई, कैसे? मुसलमान नाम है और फिर एक हिंदू सरनेम है, इसका क्या मतलब बनता? So they don't seem to understand that we are integrated, that we are Hindustani, because there is almost as much Muslim contribution to our culture, to our speech. I had one notable occasion when I called, I'm coming to the end. I had this a notable occasion when I had called Mr. Modi a neech kisam ka aadmi. And and Rahul Gandhi, who was running for, who was contesting or not contesting, who was campaigning in Gujarat, sent a message out by Twitter, which I am not on, saying I should apologize. So the Republic TV man came and thrust his loudspeaker to my mouth and said, Rahul Gandhi has asked you to apologize. Will you apologize? So I said कि मैं माजरत चाहता हूँ. He said, ये क्या? What is this apology? I said, it's Urdu for apology. He says, why can't you speak in Hindi? So I said, मैं माफी मांगता हूँ. At which he said, ये ठीक है. So then I said to him कि माफी is also Urdu. So we have a language in which Mr. Modi, when he speaks his Shuddh Hindi, is constantly betraying his Muslim heritage. Because he uses Urdu words. Because the kurta pajama that he's wearing has come to us from Central Asia. If you look at Indian clothing before the 12th century, it's all unstitched. We wore dhotis. We didn't have stitched clothing. And that is why the tailoring profession, even in the 21st century, is dominated by Muslim tailors. The hair cutting, especially the hairdressing of women, it's a Muslim profession. Hindus didn't do it, which is why till today, the Nai is more often than not a Muslim. We can't be Indian without accepting 666 years of Muslim political rule and 1,000 years or more of Muslim cultural interaction with India. After all, where did Hindi, our national language, start? Here, at the residence of Nizamuddin Auliya, where Amir Khusro merged the imported languages with the existing Braj Bhasha and called it Hindavi. And Hindavi has evolved into Hindi. And equally the story of Urdu. You know, when you look at Mughal-e-Azam, the film, Akbar would be horrified being portrayed speaking in Urdu. He spoke in Persian and he regarded Urdu as the patwa, the vernacular of the soldiers in the camp. And that is how the word Urdu came into existence. And Urdu is therefore a totally Indian language. It's a totally Indian language, and yet we make a big fuss of whether it is a Muslim language or a Hindu language. There is no Muslim language, there is no Hindu language. You go to Tamil Nadu, all the Muslims speak Tamil. They don't speak Urdu at all. I won a prize once in Kerala last year with a Kerala Muslim girl who had joined the IPS. So I was given an award of excellence for secularism, and she was given some award of excellence as well. And at dinner time, she was just complaining about how in the north they expect her to speak Urdu because she's a Muslim. They were saying to her, what kind of a Muslim are you that you don't speak Urdu? And she was saying that I am a proud Malayali. I will speak Malayalam. So when you start confusing your own cultural identity as being connected with your religion instead of with your civilizational inheritance, you run into these issues which give us a very complicated relationship with Pakistan unnecessarily. At the same time, in Bangladesh, we went overboard in backing Sheikh Hasina, who won a fair election back in 1996 and again in 2009-10. And she was well disposed towards India. We made a lot of progress with her. But by the time the next election came, it was all getting very doubtful. And then in 2019, there was clear rigging. I went to Dhaka on the anniversary, the golden anniversary of liberation. And there I found even the closest advisor to Sheikh Hasina telling me that she has to legitimize her rule by having a fair election in 2024. She fiddled that election. That is why this revolution took place on the streets. And instead of saying it's a foreign country, it's for them to decide who should rule and who should not, we've got a kind of hysteria being spread in this country about the Bangladeshis being anti-Hindu. They're the only Muslim women in the world who always wear a bindi. In India, Sunit keeps telling me that look around, there's nobody but me wearing a sari. But every Bangladeshi woman is wearing a sari. So it's really awful that we should make the treatment of Hindus a foreign policy issue without realizing that we are living in a glass cage. How are we to store throne? Just look at the treatment of Muslims in India in the last 10 years. Do we want Bangladesh and Pakistan and possibly a lot of other countries in the world to be telling us how we should treat our Muslims? And why should we imagine that the Bangladeshis will feel any better about our lecturing them on how to treat Hindus? Well, they are supposed to treat Hindus like Bangladeshis, like we are supposed to treat Muslims like Indians. Now, if our record is clean, then we get the moral right to clean up the record of other countries. With Pakistan, we don't have that problem because there are virtually no Hindus left in Pakistan. But in Bangladesh, there is a sizable Hindu minority. And if this issue is made to dominate our perception of Bangladesh, then all we are really trying to do is interfere in their internal affairs and suborn their sovereignty. And that is not the way forward with neighborhood policy. So I've taken a very long time. My apologies, but you all seemed interested, so I continued talking. And thank you very, very much for this welcome. Jai Hind.
So friends, this was a master class in diplomacy and India's neighborhood, so I do not think there is any time for questions. So maybe, sir, we will invite you for a cup of tea sometime, in which there will only be questions and answers, and that will hopefully satisfy our audience here. So thank you very much. Thank you, sir, for coming, and thank you, audience.